Hello, and welcome to Traverse. My name is Franziska Eri. I'm a theatre and opera director talking to you from the Ram Theatre in Budapest, Hungary. Every week, I'll be talking to different industry professionals from all over the world about their careers, the shifts and adjustments they had to make during this pandemic, and their hopes and dreams for the future. This is Traverse. What's next for our industry?
Today's guest is British journalist and novelist Lyn Gardner. Lyn is an award-winning critic and currently works as an associate editor of The Stage. She has written about theatre and performance for The Guardian and The Independent, and was a founder member of City Limits, the largest publishing co-op in Europe. She currently writes a strand of articles for the British Council on Culture after Brexit. The pandemic has changed the way we see venues and their relationships with artists. Lyn has written many articles on this subject and often ponders on how the culture of theatre will survive.
Hi, Lyn. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well. And you?
I'm good too, thank you. I'm so glad to have you here on this show. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, not at all. I think it's an auspicious day. I've seen the snowdrops in the garden. Yeah, which looks
really?
lovely.
Whereabouts are you right now?
I'm just outside of London, and for the last year, my dad is 93, so just as the pandemic was hitting, I moved in with him so that I could shield him for the duration. But little did I know that a year later I would still be here.
Yeah, here we are still. Do you have a different opinion of how the pandemic has been going for theatre specifically this year?
Well, I mean, for theatre in the UK, I mean, the pandemic has been going really badly. I mean, it's been a complete disaster. But I think there's been a sort of shift in thinking. I think that when theatre closed down in mid-March in the UK, many people thought, oh, this is something that will just happen for, a few weeks, and then we will be back as normal. And of course, actually, that thinking has changed substantially. But I think the moment at which you catch me, at which we're talking, which is, in February, when we are in another lockdown, I think for many people in theatre, feels like the grimmest time that we've been through. There was quite a lot of hope into the summer that theatre would be able to open up. Certainly in London, Manchester, and in other places, there have been attempts prior to Christmas to do so. And of course, all those hopes were then crushed when the shows had to shut down, maybe pivot to digital. And so people now, they've had their fingers burnt, and they're really, really cautious about how they might open up in the future.
Yeah, and especially bigger buildings and institutions that kind of have to, create a season way in advance. I assume it is very difficult to program right now. And as you said, there is a pivot to digital. Have you seen any digital work that you thought was really capturing the essence of theatre for you?
I think it's very difficult. I think without doubt that things which are live streamed from a theatre which has no audience but does have the actors present often has a feeling of connection that when you're just watching something is filmed, that is filmed, doesn't. But the things I think that I've most enjoyed are things that have genuinely tried to interact with an audience. I mean, it's really odd because in some ways I'm one of those people when there is kind of interaction in the theatre, audience participation sort of slightly freezes and goes, please don't choose me. But actually in a digital context, having that live interaction is really important. And I think one of the things that it's made me realise is that when I go to the theatre, I am not just going to the theatre for what it is that I watch on the stage. I am going to the theatre for the audience. I have been just a couple of times since the pandemic, during that very brief window when it was possible for theatre to happen here in London. And I just sort of sat really as much open-mouthed about the audience and their reaction as I did about the actors. That was part of the joy of being there. So I you know, my view about it is that you can't, of course, entirely replicate that in a digital context. But you can do things which are similar, and you can absolutely make the experience that we are in the same room, in the way that you and I at this moment are hundreds of miles apart, and yet, you know, we are having a conversation. And I think theatre can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And those instances when you actually got to go to physical theaters, were those socially distanced audiences? Did you see any solutions that were a bit more creative than just leaving a couple of seats empty?
I'm afraid I didn't. They were socially distanced. I think that moving forward, that is a significant problem, because lots of theatre just isn't going to be viable unless if it is socially distanced. And gosh, I don't want to be gloomy, I really don't, but you know, at the moment it's very easy to turn around and say, oh, we have no known cases that have happened because of people being in the theatre. But that's not to say, we may not know about them, but that's not to say that they might not happen. And I think that there is really, for many theatre buildings, certainly in the UK, many of which, of course, were built many, many years ago, you know, more than a century ago, it's not just about how you get the audience in and out, or whether or not you can socially distance them. It is also about issues around ventilation. But it doesn't mean all is lost. Of course it doesn't. You know, theatre has been going on for thousands of years. A pandemic will not stop theatre eventually going on again. I have absolutely every confidence in that. But I think what it can and might do, and I think that is no bad thing at all, is that it might shift where theatre happens, how it's distributed, where it takes place, how it conceives of space. And I think all those things are really, really interesting for theatre. And I would certainly say, again, within a UK context, you know, people making theatre in the UK have thought more about digital during the last 11 months than they probably thought about it during the previous 11 years.
It's so
and
true.
if they did think about it, they thought about it and went, oh, no, spooky, that's difficult, I don't know how to go there. And of course, suddenly they have had to go there. And I think that a lot of people are having quite a good time playing with its possibilities. And my view would be is that, you know, all technologies at some point seem a bit scary, and all technologies are new. I mean, after all, limelight was new at one point, you know, in theatre practice. And if you are an artist, why wouldn't you want to play with every tool that is available in the toolbox? And I don't for a moment think, I absolutely understand those artists who are going, digital is not for me. I will be interested to see whether, if we move into a world where things are more hybrid, whether they might change their mind in the end. But I also, you know, I think there are some interesting companies who are doing some interesting things. I mean, just during the last few weeks, I've done shows that have taken place over 2 weeks. I've done shows that have been delivered to me by postcard, down the telephone, by personal one-on-one calls, by email, by text message, by WhatsApp. And I think all those things are, you know, kind of really, really interesting. Do I think that we won't all want to gather together in one place at 7:30 on Wednesday evenings in the future? Of course we will.
Of
But I
course we
think we
will.
might want to do these other things as well.
I think buildings that are using this time to allow artists to come in and explore what is possible.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, for example, the Battersea Art Centre that is collaborating with Liver, or the Dummer Theatre that is doing this new writers opportunity where they actually get to write for stuff that is digital. I think it's incredible. And I'm wondering, do you think there's a shift in what buildings can do and what artistic directors should be doing right now, rather than actually stocking up on potential productions?
Yeah, I think that there has to be a shift in that. And I think it is about the responsibility of buildings and about the fact that often buildings are the best resourced, the best funded places, and the most established places within British theatre. So they occupy a kind of privileged space. And I think at a moment when in British theatre, over 70% of the workforce is a freelance workforce, and many of them have been hit, obviously, very, very badly by the pandemic. Then I think there is a responsibility for all arts institutions, whether they are building-based or not, actually to be supporting their communities. And one of their communities that they need to support is obviously their freelance artists. It is a truly dreadful experience in the UK for many of these artists who have fallen in between the cracks of any of the government support schemes that there are. Most of them will be self-employed. Many of them would have had another job, possibly a job that would have, of which they would pay tax at source, and as a result of that, they have been excluded from the freelance support schemes. And many of them are leaving the profession, leaving the industry. They simply cannot afford to carry on being artists. And so I think this is a moment of reckoning for British theatre. And I think it's a moment when British theatre actually, has to really consider about whether it's living its values. David Byrne from the New Diorama Theatre, I thought, put it extremely well in a conversation that he and I had when he said, when theatre thinks of businesses like Deliveroo, which has no kitchens, or Uber, which has no cars, we sort of think of ourselves to some extent as being kind of better than those kind of businesses. But theatres mostly have no artists. They simply do not have any artists on their staff who are on, employed on salaries. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has really shown up is that the difference between, people who are on salary and perhaps might be furloughed and therefore only getting 80% of their salary, but they are getting a salary, and the people actually who are getting nothing, who are the artists, who are the people who make the art that goes in the buildings or in the institutions. There are plenty of things that are wrong with British theatre, and it needs to consider, but that is an absolutely prime one, not least actually because the artists who are most vulnerable in that situation are often the artists who are earliest in their careers, who are most diverse, and often whose practice is, most different and will be the practice that will regenerate theatre in the way that it needs to be regenerated all the time. So, their loss, I think, would be truly terrible for British theatre.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about that because
I want to talk a little bit about repertory theatre and how it's actually not that common in the UK.
Yeah.
When I had to come to Budapest because of the pandemic and was stuck here, I got asked to do a show in May, and the reason why it didn't work is because the company was, resident at the theater, so it was very easy to get everyone in the same location very quickly. Do you think that's something that UK theatre should be moving towards?
I think what UK theatre should, and I think will, out of necessity, be moving towards, is about the idea that you make work which is local, which is embedded within local communities, and which is very strongly networked. I also would add to that I also think that it will probably be hybrid. To some degree. But whether that means that it will be repertory, I don't know. And I think that might be because in a British context, what you mean by a repertory company is very different from what is meant in a European context. And so I think in a UK context, it would be largely that people think of repertory theatres as being something that continued until about, 50 or 60 years ago. And it was the way most local theatres were run, which is that they had a company of actors who put on plays, and they would put on a new play every sort of 2 weeks. And when they got the first play up and running, they would then rehearse the second play, join the day, and then play the other one during the evening. And gradually more shows would enter the repertory. Theatre, of course, is made in a very different way. A lot of work is not plays. Yes, and though British theatre is still, to some degree, certainly more than European theatre, dominated by drama rather than possibly theatre, yes. The shifts of the last 20 years have been considerable. In UK theatre, as I'm sure is the case elsewhere, what happens on the outside, on the fringes, often eventually makes its way to the centre in terms of practice and how things are made. So, whereas it would have been 20 years ago pretty unlikely that the National Theatre might ever put on something that began as a piece of devised work, now that might well be the case. Yeah. So could you have, I think any return, and there has been talk, there is always talk, normally it comes from elderly actors who have had shining careers, who benefited enormously from everything they learnt in terms of skill and craft when they were in the repertory system themselves, back in the 1950s or 60s. And clearly, I'm not knocking that. I think that's great. But as to whether you could return to that in the way that in a UK context we think of repertory theatre, I think the answer is absolutely no, you could not, because you simply just wouldn't put on play after play after play in that way. Could you have artists employed by buildings? Of course you could. And I think that we should. I think you could also have companies who are attached and working with buildings. So I wonder whether in the future that we might start looking at a theatre less about being a kind of silo, which is there to put on theatre and be led probably by an artistic director with an artistic hierarchy and with people choosing what it is that happens, and that they may become more kind of creative hubs. And they would be creative hubs which whose purpose would be to support communities of artists, and also to co-create and support communities of ordinary people who live geographically quite close.
You are someone who's had a very, very long career as a theatre critic, and I was wondering if you'd like to tell us a little bit about like how you became one and how different was reviewing then than now, right now in the pandemic.
Right. Oh, gosh. I became a theatre critic sort of really by accident. I think there probably are people who shoot out of their mother's womb, you know, holding a notebook and a pencil and going, I'm going to be a theatre critic. But that definitely wasn't me. I grew up, I did kind of lots of drama and theatre at school. I was very lucky. I went to a school that kind of really valued that. I guess I probably thought that eventually I might act. Then I went to university and I directed a lot. But the thing is, I sort of came at a point, I think you probably need role models in order to be able to project and see yourself forward. I mean, interestingly, when I was at university, I directed a lot, but I never directed on the main stage. I did lots of stuff where I covered the kind of junior common room with tinfoil and put tea lights, gosh, the fire hazard, you know, around everywhere, and put on shows like that. And I did lots of things in kind of found spaces. Actually, all the stuff that I went on to be, you know, very interested in. So I then would like to, I think, to have been a director, but I didn't know how you would be a director at that point. I didn't know any female theatre directors, really. And I didn't know how you got into that. But I'd also done quite a lot of journalism while I was at college, and I sort of did see that there were ways into that. And eventually it came that I went and worked for a listings magazine called City Limits, which was set up as a kind of rival to Time Out. In fact, the staff from Time Out had left Time Out en masse and gone to City Limits, and I went and worked there, and I worked in the theatre department there. Initially, actually, I worked in the advertising department and then in the theatre department, and you know, the rest is you know, it all came from there, really. How have things changed? I think things have changed enormously for the better. When I started out writing about theatre in the 1980s, and this remained true until you know, probably 15, 20 years ago, and the arrival of the internet, was that you could only really write about theatre if you had a platform to write about theatre. And the only people who had a platform to write about theatre were about 15 to 18 people, almost all men, yeah? Almost all Oxbridge educated, almost all from particular backgrounds. And I think the thing that has changed in British theatre criticism is about the fact that during the last, you know, 15 or so years, anyone can have a platform. And so therefore the conversation around theatre has broadened enormously and become much, much more interesting.
Yeah, and you said this once, which I really stuck with me. You said that being a theatre critic is almost like being a midwife, which really stuck with me, because I think when you go on Twitter and you tweet about a show, you are essentially doing just that. Do you think reviewing now is more of a shared goal then? And do you see that it's changing a little bit in terms of digital reviews as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. One, there are more places where you can read reviews, and actually, you know, anyone can just set up their own blog and write about theatre if they want to. And my view around that is always, you know, that somebody who has never seen Hamlet might have more interesting things to say about Hamlet than somebody who's seen Hamlet 35 times. You know, I'm not for a moment, you know, saying that I don't think that expertise is useful. You know, one of the things until the last year, you know, that fundamentally just made me different, maybe from somebody else who was just starting to write about, of wanting to write about theatre, is about the fact that I went to the theatre 5 or 6 nights a week.
Mm.
Inevitably, if you do that, what is going on is that you're having this constant conversation in your head where things are bouncing off of each other and where you're kind of weighing up one thing against another. It's one of the reasons, actually, I really love festivals, because festivals seem to me, like that just wonderful sort of week or 2 or 3 weeks in the case of the Edinburgh Fringe, where something takes place and it's sort of out of real life, but that actually you're talking about lots of work within the context of a festival. So I think those things are really kind of interesting, and I think the more people who are talking about theatre, the better the conversation. And I think one of the things I very early on decided, I guess, in my career, back in the 1980s, which was a time when there were lots of women starting to write plays. And I sort of started to look at some of the reviews that were written by my colleagues at that time, mostly men. And my feeling was that what they were doing all the time was putting up barriers and saying, oh no, this is not how you write a play. This is, that you need to know the rules in order before you're, that they were telling these young women playwrights effectively that they had to go away and learn the rules. And I kind of went, but why? Actually, the best art breaks the rules. It finds new forms. It tells different stories. So it felt to me that what had happened was that critics had kind of ossified into these people who were putting up more barriers. And as far as I could see, theatre anyway had enough barriers of its own, that there were enough gatekeepers, and that, and so that if one could perhaps try and be a midwife in some ways, that was a more satisfying, a more joyous, a more enjoyable thing to actually try and do. And I suppose what came out of that was a particular interest in really trying to seek out a lot of the work that was being made that on the whole actually was just not covered by the mainstream press.
That's just the way you were talking about barriers really struck a chord with me, because I think it is definitely better, but I still think there is a lot of work to be done in that area. And also I think just questioning who gets to talk about the work as well is also, I think, really, really prominent. You once said something about how it's useful for a theatre critic to read fashion reviews or go to other disciplines and actually borrow language from other areas. Do you think there are other platforms that reviewers who are starting out or want to write about digital work should look to?
I think that reviewing needs to be kind of freed up. I mean, it's very interesting because for the last, couple of years, I've worked for a digital platform called Stage Door App. And in fact, and it's probably to do with the fact that I am, as old as I am, and it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. One of the things I was really looking forward to was about the fact that I thought, I am no longer constrained but in the way you are when you write for a national newspaper, that a review has to be exactly a certain length and it has to conform to very specific conventions. In all the years that I worked at The Guardian, it would not have been possible for me to try and write my review of the show I'd seen the night before, maybe at the Almeida, in the form of a sonnet or a haiku, and actually there's no reason why I shouldn't do that now but actually I'm not very good at doing it. But I think there are lots of younger reviewers out there who are playing with these things in exactly the same way that we talked right at the beginning of this about artists using digital to play with every tool in the toolbox. critics, you know. And I think that there are critics who are doing exactly the same thing, sometimes on personal websites, occasionally on sites maybe like Exeunt, where they are writing, you know, and trying to write in a different way. So, you know, not so long ago, I saw something written on Exeunt, which was done using twine. And, you know, that seems to me, I may go, I'm not sure that's necessarily for me, but I think it's just fantastic that people are trying these things, you know, and who knows, you know, I might yet with a, you know, bit of encouragement try and do these things, you know. After all, I do remember saying to somebody when I first went on Twitter in 2008, and I kind of said to a friend, well, I've started to do this thing, but I just don't think people are going to be really interested in what I had for breakfast, you know.
And how many thousand followers do you have now, Lyn?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, actually, I don't keep, but I think it's over 60,000. Yeah, yeah. So
yeah, we do read what you tweet for sure.
Yeah. But I never do tell anyone what I've had for breakfast. You know, I actually only really tweet around theatre.
There was this conversation that popped up with the European Theatre Club, which started a conversation around UK-based artists looking at European work and looking at international work, which I think is really, really important, because right now the world really opened up with digital streaming, and you can be sitting in a theater in Germany, you know. Do you think that is something that might open up the UK? Right now, it's a very tender matter because of Brexit. But do you think that's going to make artists think across genres and across nations as well?
I think they have to, and I think that one of the things that artists in the UK feel really strongly about is that they want to maintain those international conversations and those international collaborations. Yeah, you know, I think the reality is that UK theatre culture has it has got infinitely better, but it is still quite inward looking. And actually, I've long argued that it would be absolutely fantastic if the Arts Council was able to supply funding for young artists to travel abroad and see theatre in other places, because it's always valuable, it's always cross-pollinates work. We can absolutely see that you know, art is something that doesn't need to have borders, and that it does kind of increase understanding between people. So I think that British theatre just at the moment feels that the twin things of Brexit and of the pandemic have made it feel kind of encircled and made it feel kind of narrower. I am very concerned that moving forward that there will be so much less money, that tendency to look inwards rather than outwards might be really increased. But, you know, there are good signs as well. You know, Payne's Plough has been doing a digital collaboration with a theatre in Germany. They have got the theatre has got a digital department and therefore has the skills, and that they've connected German playwrights with UK playwrights, and that they are working together. I think people working in the arts in the UK are so aware of what it is that they have lost and what more they may lose, that actually it will make them redouble their efforts to actually make those connections and those collaborations. And I think in the longer term that will apply to buildings. In fact, I had a very interesting conversation with some programmers in Slovakia not long ago, and they were saying that they had noticed, this was just prior to the pandemic, that institutions in the UK who in the past kind of had kept their doors firmly closed were more interested in having conversations. Gosh, that can only be a good thing, because I think certainly British theatre makers are absolutely aware that they have the most to lose from this.
But do you think there is a way to move those collaborations to a digital platform, or if this is like helpful for us, like a digital way of connecting?
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, one of the things about digital, I mean, you know, digital has difficulties. And one of the things, certainly in terms of it as a platform for distributing work to audiences, is, again, certainly here in the UK, unless I don't know as much in Europe, but in the UK, there is a lot of digital poverty. I mean, there is a lot of poverty, full stop. You know, we are one of the richest nations in the world, and yet millions of children live below the breadline, which is outrageous. But there was a lot of digital poverty. So there are issues around access in that way. But one of the, course, the absolutely phenomenal things about digital is that you no longer need to collaborate with artists who are, you know, just around the corner from you. And therefore, I think, you know, the possibilities of that are still untapped. But I think, for example, the withdrawal, the absolutely crushing withdrawal of the UK from Creative Europe, which it could have paid into and continued doing, and which, of course, it was a major player with the British companies and artists leading on a number of projects with that, I think do lead UK artists in a very, very difficult position. But I would also say from that, you know, there are clearly huge difficulties, but I think it is often, again, those artists who are in earlier stages of their careers, who are digital natives, who are fearless, and I think they absolutely have the yen and the determination that they will continue collaborating with other artists in Europe and across the world. Many, many young people in the UK, and people like myself, we think of ourselves as Europeans.
That's very good to hear. As someone who's a European based in London, that's very good to hear. There's quite a lot of productions that are, you know, have been in the archive for a long time and now are picked up again and streamed or made available digitally. If you could choose one production that you would love to see revived that way, what would it be?
I guess from a British company or UK company, I'd love to see Tristan and Isolde, which was a knee-high production from a number of years ago, directed by Emma Rice. But having said that, what I would also like to see is, I would like to see, I guess, I don't really want to see something that's been picked off the shelf and that was filmed on a single camera from somewhere at the back of the theatre, kind of in, you know, 1997. I think on the whole, that work that we've seen a lot of, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, is less interesting. What I want to see is those productions remade for digital in some way. Yeah.
And have you seen any productions during the pandemic that used that really, really well?
Well, I think there has been some good stuff that's done like that. I think there is something. I think one of the reasons, possibly, that and I don't know whether this is true in Europe. Do you think that in European theatre there has been a bit of a kind of nervousness around digital, or do you think it is a UK thing?
I actually can't speak for every European country, but in Hungary, certainly, they have this initiative called Színház TV, which means theater TV, and it is specifically showing productions that were filmed and now you can watch it back?
No, the reason I ask is because I think one of the things that happened here in the UK was has been why there has been a fear of digital is because lots of people have simply looked at the National Theatre Live model and all the kit that was required, all the funding that was required, all the expertise that was required, and just went, oh no, we can't do that. Yes. And I think where the shift in the pandemic has come, and which is very interesting, is about actually them going, we still can't do that for all those reasons, but we can do other and more interesting things. So I think what happened was that people thought that the NT Live model was the only show in town, and it wasn't something that they could possibly replicate or get anywhere near. And actually, I think they have now turned around and said, oh, well, but what is it that we can do with our phones, with maybe with one camera? What can we do with audio? I think some of the most interesting stuff in the UK has been audio based.
Do you have any examples that we can?
Well, I think there's been some interesting stuff done with Darkfield, who are a company who in the past have done shows often on quite a small scale, which have involved you being in a shipping container with a large number of other people, but often in the dark. And with the show actually coming to you through headphones in that live physical space, and playing and tricking you with your mind and what you think is happening and what is really happening and those things. And a number of the things that they've done actually online, it transfers to digital extremely well. There are companies like Coney, who have long been kind of experimenters in this field. Coney, of course, are the company, who have the absolutely brilliant idea that a theatre show starts the minute that you hear about it, and it only ends when you stop thinking about it. The idea that it can have a very long tail in some ways. So I think the possibilities are endless. We are just right at the very beginning of this. And my view about it is that, and again, this comes from a long experience of, working where and being interested in new forms and different kinds of theatre, and endlessly kind of editors on national newspapers or friends saying to me when I would say, oh, I'm going to go off and review this thing, and it takes place in a treehouse and you have to stay overnight, and most of the time you will be on your own, and they go, but Lyn, is this theatre? And I kind of always go, but that's absolutely the wrong question to be asked. The interesting question is, what is it that theatre can be? And I think at this moment, in terms of digital, we are asking that question. What is it that theatre can be? And it could be that in a few years' time we go, oh, well, that didn't really work, or that doesn't work, but we will constantly find other things to do. And coming back to the NT model, the NT Live, which is the kind of high-end filming of productions. Listen, they absolutely fantastic. They serve a purpose, but there is a vast difference between watching that sitting alone and watching it on your laptop or on your TV at home, and even watching it in a cinema with lots and lots of other people. I mean, the thing I find absolutely fantastic about that, or interesting, is that in the cinema context, the audience behaves exactly as though they're at the theatre. Yeah,
so
they
true.
treat it as though they are. I saw the Benedict Cumberbatch Hamlet at the Odeon, Leicester Square, which holds thousands of people, and it was an extraordinary experience. Again, coming back to it, as much for the audience as for the fact that we were watching something being live streamed, and the audience behaved exactly as a theatre.
That's the one NT Live show I saw as well, the Benedict Cumberbatch Hamlet. At the Barbican, Lindsay Turner directing. Just catching everyone else up who might have not seen it. And I remember distinctly just feeling this rush that we have to get to the cinema
Yeah.
because that's when it starts and it's live. I think the liveness of it really, and as you said,
Yeah.
being together with an audience. But being together with an audience who's also eating popcorn. I saw it at Genesis, East London, so it was a bit more relaxed. It did feel a bit different than being in the Barbican for sure. I have one last question for you, Lyn, which is what I always ask for my guests. I'm in a 650 seater. If you were here with me, and if anything were possible, what would you like to see in this space?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know. I mean, what I would really like you to see is to use the space entirely differently. Yes. So I would be interested less probably in the state. I would be interested about, can you stage the show in the auditorium? Can you use a theatre as a found space in some ways? What happens, if you stage, if you flip things around, if you stage the show in the backstage areas of the theatre? And I think these questions, I think it's kind of important, because I think that actually theatre is going to have to think about these things moving forward, that it may be completely impossible, and none of us, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball and none of us know, but that there may be social distancing for a very, very long time to come. There is likely in the event, as well, will clearly happen, that the pandemic will become endemic, that there will be flare-ups, and therefore the need for maybe local shorter lockdowns, but nonetheless. And so I think theatre does need to think, what is it can and might be able to do that it would may be able to do even in these circumstances. And clearly the idea that you might gather lots and lots of people into a theatre space like the one in which you're sitting, I think becomes more problematic. But again, I think that's exciting. I think that's interesting. In the same way that we can talk about who does or doesn't, have a salary from a theatre, or who is it that gets to make work. Actually thinking about, what do we mean by a theatre, and what can we do with a theatre space, and do completely differently from what we have done in the past with those spaces, I think it's potentially thrilling.
Well, I'm glad that you're thrilled about it. That means we should all be thrilled about it. Thank you so much, Lyn, for coming on and for sharing your wisdom. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you.
Listen, thank you very much for having me on. And, I hope that when you're back in London, we might be able to go to the theatre together one time.
I would love that, even if it involves rapid testing or, a completely different ritual to what we're used to. I would be glad to go with you.
Rapid testing, that's not a goer, I can tell you.
This was Traverse. Thank you so much for joining us, and join us next time.